The kitchen was empty in a way that wasn't simply about furniture, though most of the furniture had already been taken. Marin Whitlock stood at the counter at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in early March, watching the rain run sideways across the bay window. Garrett had insisted on installing the summer they bought the house in 1987, and she understood for the first time in her 74 years exactly what the word stripped meant. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The certified envelope from Driscoll, Hayes, and Bowman lay on the granite where the toaster used to be. The final decree. The numbers inside it. The judge's signature. 51 years of marriage reduced to a stack of paper she had signed yesterday afternoon in a conference room downtown, while a man named Andrew Driscoll, who was younger than her firstborn nephew, slid pages across the polished walnut table and explained that this was the best her own attorney had been able to negotiate. She had walked out of that office with a check for $41,000, the keys to a 4-year-old Honda Civic, and a list of items from the marital home she was permitted to retrieve between the hours of 9 and noon on Wednesday, provided she gave 24 hours notice. She had not slept. She had stood at this counter most of the night. When the gray morning finally came up over the alley behind the Tedford's house, she realized she did not know where she was going to go. Garrett would be moving back into the house tomorrow afternoon. The locksmith was scheduled for Thursday. Tessa Bowen, who was 38 years old and had been the executive assistant at Whitlock Pipeline Services for the better part of 6 years, would bring her things over the weekend. Marin had learned this from the housekeeper, Linda, who was not supposed to tell her, but who had stood in the laundry room 3 weeks earlier with her arms folded and said, "Mrs. Whitlock, I am too old to keep secrets that hurt good people. He has been renting an apartment over by the Polo Club until everything finalizes. She has already chosen the new bedding. I am sorry." Linda had been with them for 26 years. Marin set the certified envelope down on top of the 4 other envelopes already on the counter. Bank statement. Cobra notification. A second notice from the storage facility on Big Spring Street, where she had been keeping her mother's things since Wynne had died 11 years back. A reminder from the dentist that her cleaning was scheduled for Friday. She did not know if she would still have dental insurance on Friday. She did not know a great many things now that she would have known yesterday. She made herself one last cup of coffee using the coffee maker that was not on the list of items she was allowed to take. The house was an 80s Tudor, brick and beige stucco, with the kind of yard the Junior League photographed for their garden tour every spring. Marin had not asked for any of it. Garrett had wanted it. Garrett had wanted everything they had, and Marin, who had been the kind of bride in 1973 who believed her job was to make the man she had married feel chosen every single day for the rest of her life, had built a life around what Garrett wanted, and at 74 she was holding a coffee mug she would have to leave on the counter when she walked out the door. She had been a nurse. She had been a good one. She had worked 31 years at Midland Memorial in the cardiac unit, the last 14 as charge nurse on the night shift, and she had retired 5 years ago at Garrett's insistence because, he said, "You have worked your whole life, sweetheart. You deserve to enjoy yourself now." The pension was modest. Garrett had handled the rollover. Marin had signed where he had pointed. The terms of the divorce had revealed, among other things, that $23,000 of her own pension money had been used 3 years earlier to make the down payment on a condo at a golf resort in Horseshoe Bay that was titled solely in Garrett's name. Phil Markham, her attorney, had explained that recovering it would have required forensic accounting Marin could not afford and a year of additional litigation Garrett's firm was prepared to fund indefinitely. "Take the $41,000, Phil had said in his office 2 weeks ago. "Marin, I am telling you as a friend now and not as your lawyer. Take it. Get out. Start over. Do not let him bleed you for 2 more years just to prove a point you cannot afford to prove." She had taken it. She drank the coffee slowly, looking around the kitchen. The pendant lights over the island that she had hated since the day they were installed. The pot rack she had refused to use because the pots clanged when she walked underneath them. The wine cooler Garrett had bought for his Burgundy collection that she had never been allowed to touch. None of it was hers. None of it ever had been. She had been the woman who lived inside Garrett Whitlock's life, and Garrett Whitlock had decided he wanted his life to belong to somebody else now. And that was the simple and terrible math of the morning. She rinsed the cup. She set it upside down on the dish towel. She picked up her purse and her car keys and her phone and the manila folder containing her copy of the divorce decree. She walked out of the kitchen and through the front entry where the Persian runner Garrett had bought in Istanbul still ran the length of the hallway, and she stepped onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind her, and she did not turn around. The Civic was parked under the porte-cochere. The rain had thinned to a fine cold mist that was not quite enough to use the wipers for. Marin sat in the driver's seat for a long time with her hands on the wheel, the engine off, looking at the house she had lived in for 37 years. Then she started the car and backed down the driveway and pointed it toward downtown. She had booked a room at the Holiday Inn Express off Loop 250 because it had been the cheapest place she could find with a coffee maker in the room and a continental breakfast included. The clerk who checked her in at 8 in the morning was a young woman with a name tag that read Sarit, who did not look at her twice, and Marin was grateful for it. She carried her overnight bag and her purse and the manila folder up to room 214 and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she took her shoes off. Then she did what she had been putting off doing for almost 3 weeks. She drove to the storage facility. SecureStay Storage on Big Spring Street was a long, flat building of red metal roll-up doors that had been built in the mid-90s when the oil boom was on. Marin had been paying $92 a month on Unit 408 for the past 11 years because she had not been able to bring herself to go through her mother's things after Wynne had died, and Garrett had not wanted any of it in the house. He had said the house had its own aesthetic. He had said her mother's furniture would clash. Marin had said yes, and put everything in storage, and paid the bill every month, and never once gone inside the unit. The man at the front desk was named Eldred, and he had been there as long as Marin had been a customer. He looked up from his crossword and gave her a small nod. "Long time, Mrs. Whitlock." "I am sorry I have been so quiet," Marin said. "I think I am going to need to clear it out." Eldred looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he handed her a key on a red plastic tag and pointed her down the corridor. Unit 408 was at the end of the back row, where the rain had pooled against the concrete apron and the gravel had been washed thin. Marin slid the key into the padlock, and the lock came open easier than she had expected. She rolled the door up. The smell of old cardboard and old fabric and the faint trapped warmth of 11 Texas summers came out at her, and she stood there in the doorway for a long moment before she stepped inside. Her mother's life was stacked in front of her. 48 cardboard boxes, neatly labeled in Wynne's careful schoolteacher handwriting. For steamer trunks. A walnut hall tree. A sewing machine in its original wooden cabinet. A box spring and a mattress wrapped in plastic. The rolled-up rug from the front room of Wynne's house on Sycamore Street in Lamesa, where Marin had grown up and where her mother had lived alone for the 23 years between her husband's death and her own. Marin walked to the back of the unit where the smaller boxes were stacked. She sat down on a folding chair her mother had used for bridge nights, and she let her hands rest on her knees, and she sat there for a long time without doing anything at all. Then she began to open boxes. Photographs of Wynne in her wedding dress in 1948. Her father's Korean War medals. A Bible that had belonged to her grandmother Edith Holcomb, a woman Marin had met only twice as a child and remembered chiefly as a tall, sharp-eyed presence in a navy blue dress who smelled of Cody face powder and pipe tobacco. A folder of mortgage paperwork on the Lamesa house. 3 boxes of cookbooks. A box of Christmas ornaments wrapped in tissue paper that had begun to disintegrate. A box of her father's tools. In the 7th box she opened, beneath a pile of Marin's own school papers from the 2nd grade, she found a metal lockbox. It was the kind of fireproof document box that women of her mother's generation used to keep important papers in. Olive green, slightly rusted at the hinges, about the size of a hardback book. Marin lifted it out of the cardboard box and set it on the seat of the folding chair and looked at it. She did not have the key. She knew where the key would be, though. Her mother had been a methodical woman. She had kept all her important keys on the same brass ring she kept in the same blue china dish on her bureau. Marin had brought the dish home 11 years ago and put it in a smaller box that she had labeled, in pen, dresser top, and she had not seen it since. It took her almost an hour to find it. The dish had been packed inside a box labeled Wynne Kitchen, which made no sense until Marin opened it and found, along with the dish, a stack of dish towels Wynne had embroidered in the 1950s, 2 ceramic salt and pepper shakers shaped like roosters, and the silver napkin ring with Marin's name engraved on it that Wynne had received as a wedding present in 1948 and had passed to Marin the day Marin had married Garrett in the small Methodist church in Lamesa on a Saturday afternoon in May of 1973. The brass key ring was at the bottom of the dish. Marin carried it back to the lockbox. She tried 3 keys before she found the right one. The lock turned with a small, dry click. She lifted the lid. Inside were 3 things. The first was an envelope addressed to Marin in her mother's handwriting, dated 3 months before Wynn's death. The second was a sheaf of legal-size papers, folded in thirds, slightly yellowed at the edges, secured with a brittle rubber band that snapped in Marin's fingers as she lifted them. The third was a smaller manila envelope containing what looked at first like a passport-size photograph and a folded sheet of cream-colored paper. Marin took the envelope addressed to her first. She held it for a long minute before she opened it. The letter inside was not long. Wynn had been a woman who said what she meant and then stopped speaking. Marin had inherited her economy of words from her mother, though she had spent 51 years married to a man who needed to fill every silence, and so she had largely lost the habit. Marin, the letter began, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are likely going through my things at a time when you need to. I want you to know I waited a long time to tell you about what is in this box, and I am sorry that I waited. I told myself many things. That you were happy, that Garrett would handle things, that you did not need the burden of one more property when you had so much already. I was wrong about all of it, but mostly I was wrong about Garrett. I never trusted him, Marin. I never told you, and now I think that was a kind of cowardice. The ranch belongs to you. Your grandmother Edith deeded it to you on your 23rd birthday, the spring you graduated from nursing school, 3 months before you married. She did it because she did not approve of Garrett, and she did not want him ever to have what was yours, and she made me promise I would not tell you about it until I was certain you would need it. She held that ranch in trust her whole life, and when she died in 1986, the trust passed to me, and I held it, and I paid the taxes on it every year out of my own checking account, because I did not want to ask you any questions you would not have wanted to answer. It is a small place. It was Edith's mother's, before her, and her mother's before that. There are about 210 acres, and a house, and a barn, and a windmill, and a creek that runs in the spring. It is not pretty in the way Garrett would understand pretty. It is in Brewster County, off County Road 2627, about 31 miles north of Marathon, and the gate is the second left after you cross the cattle guard at the old Hadley place. The deed is in this box, in your name, never my name, never your father's name. Garrett does not know it exists. No one knows it exists. I am the only person who has paid the taxes for 43 years, and I have arranged for the trust to continue paying them out of my estate for 10 years beyond my death, which gives you until 2025 to make a decision. After that, the taxes will come to you, but the land will already be yours and will have been yours since 1973. The water is good. The house is not large, but it was built strong by a Welshman named Owen Pritchard, whom Edith's mother loved before she married your great-grandfather, and the bones of it will still be holding. There is a key in this box. There is also a photograph of the house as it looked in 1962, the last time anyone in the family went out there to check on it. Marin, do not let Garrett see this letter, and do not tell him about the ranch. If you are reading this and your marriage is good and you do not need it, then leave it for someone else in the family who might, or do with it what your heart tells you. But if you are reading this and your marriage is not what we both pretended it was for so many years, then go. Go and see what Edith left you. She knew you better than anyone ever has, including me, and she protected you when I could not bring myself to. I love you. I have always loved you. Forgive me for the things I did not say. Mama Marin sat in the folding chair in the back of Unit 408 with the letter open in her lap, and she did not cry. She had not cried in 3 weeks, since the morning Linda had stood in the laundry room and told her about Tessa, and she did not cry now. What she felt was something stranger than grief. Something steady and slow, like a heavy door swinging open on a hinge that had not been used in a long time. She set the letter aside. She opened the second item. The deed was real. It was on heavy bond paper, stamped and notarized by a county clerk in Alpine, Texas in May of 1973. Edith May Holcomb, grantor, to Marin Susanna Holcomb, grantee. 211 3/10 acres in Brewster County, Texas, bounded on the north by the public road, on the east by the Tarrant Ranch, on the south by Cottonwood Creek, and on the west by Survey Line A. 227 of the original Spanish land grant designated Bramble Springs, free and clear of any encumbrance, forever and in perpetuity to the said grantee, her heirs, and assigns. The deed had been filed and recorded. The county clerk's stamp was crisp. The notary's seal was clear. Marin held the document in her hands, and she thought of her grandmother Edith, whom she had barely known, deciding 3 months before her granddaughter's wedding to a man she did not approve of to put aside a piece of land for that granddaughter and keep it secret from him for as long as it took for the granddaughter to need it. She thought of her mother paying the taxes for 43 years out of a teacher's pension. She did the math in her head. Even at a few $100s a year, that was tens of thousands of dollars Wynne had paid, for 4 decades, to keep her daughter's name on a piece of land her daughter did not know she owned. The third envelope held the photograph in the cream-colored paper. The photograph was small, black and white, the corners curled. It showed a single-story stone and clapboard ranch house with a deep covered porch, set on a long flat rise of grass with a windmill behind it and the dark hump of a mountain ridge in the distance. The light in the photograph was the long, low light of a Texas evening. There was a woman standing on the porch, hands in the pockets of her dress, looking off to the right of the camera. Marin did not recognize her, but she thought it might have been Edith herself in middle age. The cream-colored paper was an inventory. In Edith's narrow, slanting hand, written in dark blue ink that had faded only slightly, house and contents, locked at the front, and back doors and at the cellar entrance. Barn, locked at the main door, key on ring. Smokehouse, unlocked, empty. Windmill, in working order as of June 1962. Well, 214 feet deep, water-tested clean. Cistern full. Front room, my mother's pine table, 8 chairs, sideboard, wood stove, my grandfather's clock. Bedroom 1, bedstead, dresser, washstand, my mother's quilt chest. Bedroom 2, bedstead, dresser, the rocking chair from the Holcomb side. Kitchen, cook stove, dry sink, my mother's china, the green table, the curtains I made in 1958. Cellar, keep locked. Do not open without my present. E.M.H. Marin read the inventory 3 times. The last line on it. Do not open without my present. E.M.H. She turned the paper over. There was nothing on the back. She sat with the photograph and the inventory and the deed and the letter from her mother in her lap, and the rain on the metal roof of the storage facility, and she understood several things at once. She understood that her grandmother Edith, whom her mother had never quite been able to talk about, had known 45 years before anyone else in the world that Garrett Whitlock would eventually do exactly what Garrett Whitlock had done. She understood that her mother had spent the last decade of her life paying for the result. She understood that the certified envelope on the granite counter in the kitchen on Albemarle Drive, with its judge's signature and its $41,000 settlement, was not the final word on Marin Whitlock's life. It was the next to last word. The last word, evidently, was waiting for her in Brewster County at the end of a county road 31 miles north of Marathon, and had been waiting for her since the spring she graduated from nursing school. She put everything back in the lockbox very carefully. She closed the lid. She locked it with the brass key and put the key on its ring in the pocket of her cardigan. She did not put the lockbox back in the storage unit. She carried it out to the Civic and locked it in the trunk, and then she drove back to the Holiday Inn Express in a kind of stillness she had not felt since she was a very young woman, perhaps not since the morning of her own wedding, when she had stood in the foyer of the Methodist Church in Lamesa with her father's hand on her elbow and known, in some part of herself she had not yet learned to listen to, that the decision she was about to make was going to define everything else. That had been 51 years ago. The morning the rain had stopped, the May light had come through the stained glass and made a green and gold pattern on her white shoes. Marin remembered that. She remembered her father saying, "You do not have to do this, sweetheart. You say the word, and we go home." And she had looked at him and said, "Daddy, I am doing this." And she had walked down the aisle, and Garrett, whose hair had been thick and dark, had taken her hand in both of his, and she had thought she was the luckiest 23-year-old woman in the whole state of Texas. At the motel, she ate a bowl of vending machine soup, standing at the small round table by the window. She did not turn on the television. She opened her laptop and she sat down on the bed and she began to research. The ranch was real. The Brewster County Tax Assessor's website confirmed it. Parcel 2627-118, A. Owner of record, Marin Susanna Holcomb. 211.3 acres. Improvements listed. Taxes paid in full through tax year 2024, scheduled for continued payment through 2025 from a trust account at First Bank of Lamesa. Marin sat looking at her own name on the screen of her laptop, attached to a piece of land she had never set foot on, in a county she had never visited. And she thought that the strangest thing about being 74 was learning that you did not know the whole story of your own life. She did not call Phil Markham. She did not call her cousin Ruth in Abilene, who was the only family she had left in Texas. She did not call anyone. She closed the laptop. She lay down on top of the bedspread, fully dressed, and she fell asleep for the first time in 4 nights. When she woke up, it was 4:47 in the morning, and the rain had stopped. She made the bed. She showered. She put on a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt she had not worn in 15 years, because they were in the overnight bag, and because she had reached an age and an hour at which what she wore was no longer her husband's concern. She drank the bad motel coffee. She loaded her overnight bag in the lockbox and a small canvas tote of things she had pulled from her mother's storage unit on her way out, and she walked downstairs to the front desk and checked out. The girl at the desk, who was different from Sarit, looked at her over a yawn. "Driving somewhere fun, ma'am." "I do not know yet," Marin said. She thought about that answer for the next 9 hours. Midland to Marathon, by way of Fort Stockton, was a drive of about 190 miles, and Marin had not driven that far by herself in 12 years. She had driven Garrett's car to a wedding in Lubbock in 2012. Before that, she had driven her own car to her mother's funeral in Lamesa in 2014. After that, she had driven a half a dozen times a year to Midland Memorial for her cardiology checkups, and a couple of times a year up to Big Spring to see Ruth. But mostly Garrett had wanted to do the driving on the longer trips, and Marin, who was not in a hurry to die in a head-on collision with a tractor-trailer on Highway 67, had let him. The Civic was a 2020 with 18,000 miles on it. The tires were new. The wipers worked. The radio was set to the country station Garrett had liked. She turned it off and drove west out of Midland in the dawn light. She had $314 in cash from the ATM in the Holiday Inn lobby, and $41,000 in a checking account she had opened the previous Friday at a credit union Phil Markham had recommended. She had her purse, an overnight bag, a tote of her mother's things, a metal lockbox containing a deed to a ranch she had never seen, and the keys to a house that had been locked since 1962. She had not eaten breakfast. She stopped at a Whataburger outside Odessa and ate a breakfast taquito in the parking lot with the heater running, and she made herself a list on the back of the receipt. Gasoline, water, a flashlight, a pair of work boots, a pair of work gloves, a first aid kit, a road atlas, because she did not trust the cell signal in the Big Bend country, and she remembered Garrett saying once, years ago after a fishing trip he had taken with a banker friend, that you could go 30 miles in Brewster County without crossing a road, and you could go 50 miles without crossing a wire fence. She stopped at the Walmart in Fort Stockton and bought everything on the list, and a sleeping bag, and a small camp stove, and a propane cylinder, and a quart of motor oil for the Civic just in case, and a half-gallon of drinking water, and a box of granola bars, and a small bag of cracked corn she did not yet know why she was buying, except that her grandmother in the photograph had stood on a porch with her hands in her pockets, and her grandmother's mother before her had kept chickens on the same piece of land for 40 years, and Marin, who had had no children and no grandchildren and very little to call her own beyond 51 years of waiting for her husband to come home and ask about her day, was suddenly thinking about chickens. She paid in cash. She did not want anything trackable. Then she drove south. The land changed as she drove. The flat, tan grass of the southern Permian Basin gave way to longer rolling country and the first low purple-blue mountains in the distance. And the sky got bigger the way the sky did in West Texas, the way no other sky in the world that Marin had seen did. And Marin, who had not stopped to look at the sky in any deliberate way in many years, found herself slowing the car down to look at it. Marathon was a tiny town. She drove through it slowly, past the old hotel and the post office and a row of adobe-painted shops shut up for the off-season, and she turned north on a small county road that climbed away from the highway through a long curve and ran into the high open country toward the Glass Mountains. She drove for 40 minutes without seeing another car. She passed a long abandoned ranch gate with its name still in iron letters across the top, and 3 Hereford cattle standing under a low juniper, and a single red-tailed hawk on a fence post watching her go by. The county road turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to caliche, the white limestone dust rising in a thin plume behind her tires, and Marin watched the odometer and counted the miles. 28, 29, 30. At 31 2/10, she came to a cattle guard. She crossed it slowly, listening to the rattle of the bars under her tires. Her mother's directions echoed in her head. Second left after you cross the cattle guard at the old Hadley place. She slowed almost to a stop. The first left came up almost immediately, an unmarked dirt track that curved off into a stand of mesquite. The second left was almost a quarter-mile further and almost invisible from the road, a narrow caliche cut between 2 stone gateposts that had no gates strung between them anymore. Only a thin rust-colored chain hung loose across the opening with a small metal sign on it that had once been white and was now the bleached color of old bone. She stopped the car. She got out. She walked up to the sign. The lettering was faded almost to nothing, but in the long, west-leaning sun of the afternoon, she could just make out the words. Holcomb Ridge. No trespassing. Survivors will be prosecuted. The word survivors was a joke, or had been once. Marin almost smiled. Almost. She unhooked the chain. She got back in the Civic. She drove through the gate and rehooked the chain behind her, and she started up the caliche track that climbed in a long curve through bunchgrass and yucca towards something she could not yet see, but which the photograph in the lockbox in her trunk had taught her, an hour and 7 hours and 48 years ago, to expect. The track climbed for almost a mile. The land opened out, and then, just as the late afternoon light tipped over and lay flat across the rise, Marin Whitlock saw the house. It was set on a long shoulder of land facing west, with the dark blue hump of a mountain ridge rising behind it, and a windmill turning slowly to her right, and a stand of 3 enormous cottonwood trees holding their last late winter shape to her left along what must have been the line of the creek. The house itself was stone at the base and clapboard above, painted once a pale color that had weathered to the color of cream gone slightly gray, with a deep porch running the full width of the front and 4 square posts holding up its roof. The chimney on the south end stood straight. The roofline did not sag. The front door, even from 100 yards out, was closed and intact. It was exactly the house in the photograph. Marin pulled the Civic to the bottom of the rise and turned off the engine. She sat with her hands on the wheel, and she looked at the house her grandmother had bought for her with no intention of telling her. In a year when Marin Holcomb had been 23 and engaged to a man her grandmother could already see for what he was, and she thought of all the silences in her own life, all the things she had agreed to without questioning, all the times Garrett had said sweetheart in a particular way and she had handed him whatever it was he wanted, and she felt something she could not name yet move through her like weather. The windmill turned. The cottonwoods held their shapes. Somewhere behind the house, faintly, she could hear water running in a creek. She got out of the car. She walked up the rise slowly, one careful step at a time, the new work boots from the Walmart in Fort Stockton already settling into the shape of her feet, the keys to her grandmother's ranch heavy in the pocket of her cardigan, and the deep, level light of West Texas falling all around her, and somewhere in her chest, very softly. The heavy door that had begun to swing open in the back of Unit 408 swung the rest of the way open, and the air on the other side of it smelled like grass and creek, water and old stone, and for the first time in 51 years, Marin Whitlock walked towards something that was hers. She reached the porch steps. She put her hand on the railing. She looked at the front door. She did not yet know about the cellar, or about the woman who had stood on this porch in 1962 with her hands in her pockets, or about the letters in the cedar chest, or about the room behind the kitchen pantry, whose door was set flush into the paneling so cleverly that even Marin, who had grown up in houses, would walk past it 3 times before she saw it. But she knew the most important thing already. She knew she was home. She stood on the bottom step of the porch for a long time. The wind moved through the cottonwoods behind the house, and the creek ran somewhere in its thin spring run, and the windmill made a soft tick-tick-tick that Marin remembered from her childhood at her grandparents' farm outside Lamesa. The sun was almost down. The light had gone the color of pulled honey. She climbed the steps slowly. She crossed the porch. The boards under her feet were solid. Whoever had built this house had picked good lumber and had laid it down with care, and the 80 years between then and now had not undone the work. She ran her hand along the porch post as she went, and the wood was rough and warm where the sun had been on it, and she thought, fleetingly, of Garrett's brand-new bay window on Albemarle Drive, and how it had felt under her hand on the morning of the divorce, and how a thing could be brand new and feel like nothing at all. She reached the front door. The brass key from the lockbox was already in her hand. She had put it there without thinking about it, somewhere between the cattle guard and the windmill. She looked at the lock. It was an old-fashioned lever lock, the kind houses had used before deadbolts came in, set into a plate so weathered the brass had gone green at the edges. She slid the key in. It turned. The door opened on a long, deep silence that had been waiting a very long time to be broken, and Marin Whitlock, who had been a wife for 51 years and a stranger to her own self for nearly as long, stepped across the threshold of a house that had been hers since the spring she was 23, and she did not know yet what waited for her inside, only that whatever it was had been kept safe by the women who had loved her, and that it was finally her turn to find out. The door closed behind her with a soft, settled click. The house held its breath. So did she. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not the smell of mildew or rot or trapped damp, which was what she had braced herself for, but the clean, cold smell of stone and dry pine and a faint sweetness underneath, like cedar shavings or apple wood that had been put away dry 60 years ago and never disturbed. The air was still in the way that the air inside a closed church is still at 6 in the morning before anyone has come in. Marin stood in the entry and let her eyes adjust. The last of the day's light was coming sideways through the west windows, lying across the wide pine floorboards in long lateral bars of gold. She could see the dust in it. The dust was thin, not heavy, the dust of a house that had been sealed and not occupied, not the dust of a house that had been left open to the world. Whoever had closed up Holcomb Ridge in 1962 had closed it up the way a person closes a book they intend to read again. Carefully, with purpose. She stepped forward. The front room opened in front of her in a single long shape. Pine floors, plastered walls of faded buttermilk yellow, a low ceiling of beadboard, painted once a soft gray. To her left, the wood stove, a heavy black cast-iron Acme parlor stove on a stone hearth, its pipe rising straight up through the ceiling. To her right, the long pine table from the inventory, set with 8 ladder-back chairs around it, and beyond it, against the south wall, the grandfather clock. The clock was stopped at 4 minutes after 7. Marin did not know yet whether that was morning or evening. She walked the length of the front room slowly, one careful step at a time. She had been a charge nurse for 14 years on the cardiac floor at Midland Memorial, and she had walked into a great many rooms in her life that she did not know what to expect from. She knew how to read a room. She knew to keep her hands at her sides and her eyes open and to listen for the sound a place was making underneath its silence. The house was making a settled sound, the kind of sound a body in long rest makes. Not dying, not gone, resting. There was a quilt folded over the back of one of the ladder-back chairs. Marin reached out and touched it. The cotton was clean, dry, faintly cold. Wedding ring pattern, blues and creams, and a thin border of red. Hand-quilted in stitches small enough that you had to know what you were looking at to see how good they were. Marin, who had quilted for 20 years, before her shoulders had stopped letting her, knew exactly how good they were. Beside the wood stove sat a wood box. She lifted the lid. There were perhaps 24 split lengths of dry juniper inside, gray with age but not rotten, and a tin coffee can full of pine fatwood splinters, and a brass match safe tucked into the corner. Marin opened the match safe. Inside were 8 matches, sulfur-tipped, 60-something years old. She did not strike one. Not yet. She put the lid back on the wood box and stood up. The hallway ran to the back of the house from the right side of the front room. It was narrower than a modern hallway, the proportions of a house built before central heating made wide halls practical. Marin went down it slowly. The first door on her left opened into a bedroom, the second into another bedroom, and the third was the doorway to the kitchen at the back. She went into the first bedroom. A bedstead of curly maple, a feather mattress wrapped in plain unbleached muslin, a washstand with a porcelain basin on it, a small dresser with 3 drawers, and against the far wall a cedar chest that was as long as the bed and almost as wide as the dresser. Marin did not open the chest yet. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the room and noting the way the curtains had been drawn all the way back and tied with their own loops to keep the light off the rug. Whoever had closed this house had thought about the rug. The second bedroom was almost a mirror of the first, with a smaller bed and a Holcomb side rocking chair angled toward the window. The rocker was walnut, hand-turned, with a woven hickory bark seat. Marin recognized the work. Her grandfather Holcomb had made rockers. There were 2 of them at her cousin Ruth's house in Abilene that Ruth's mother had brought up from Lamesa 50 years ago. This one had the same way of curving the back slats. It belonged. She went to the kitchen. The kitchen at the back of the house was the room Marin had been most curious about, because something in the inventory list had stuck with her: the small specific tenderness of the line "my mother's china," the green table, the curtains I made in 1958. The kitchen door opened in and Marin stood in the threshold and breathed in once, sharply, in a way she could not have predicted. The room was beautiful. A long green-painted pine table down the center, with 2 long benches drawn up beside it. A dry sink with a hand pump on it under the south window. A cook stove against the east wall, black iron. A home comfort model from the Wrought Iron Range Company of St. Louis, which Marin recognized because her father had owned one in the kitchen of the Lamesa house until 1971, when he had finally caved to her mother's wish for a gas range. A china cabinet built into the north wall, glass-fronted, full of dishes. Blue willow plates. A set of cream-colored mixing bowls. A pitcher in the shape of a rooster. 3 jelly glasses on the bottom shelf with the label of a Texas dairy that had not been in business since 1958. The curtains at the windows were yellow gingham, faded almost to white at the folds. Hand-hemmed. The same neat stitches as the quilt. On the wall beside the cook stove was a calendar. Marin walked over to it and looked. June 1962. The month had been turned to June and never turned again. A small note was written in Edith's slanting hand on the square for June 14th. House closed. Locked at all 5 doors. Marin stood in front of the calendar for a long time. She did not feel like crying. She felt instead like a person who has finally come into a room where someone she has been missing for a very long time has been quietly waiting. Edith May Holcomb, whom she had met twice as a child, who had pressed a silver dollar into her palm once and told her the world hides things in plain sight, had closed this house on June 14th, 1962, with the curtains drawn back from the rugs and matches in the safe, and a quilt folded over the back of a chair, and a clock stopped at 4 minutes after 7, and the house had waited. It had waited for her. She put her hand against the wall beside the calendar. The plaster was cool. The wall was solid. The pantry was off the north end of the kitchen, a narrow room with shelves built up to the ceiling on 3 sides, a small high window at the far end, and a door at the back wall that, the inventory had not mentioned, led out to a small enclosed porch that itself opened onto the yard between the house and the smokehouse. Marin noted the configuration. The shelves held a few jars of preserves so dark with age that Marin could not have said what was inside them: a wooden box of empty mason jars, 3 folded flour sacks, and a tin of baking powder that had calcified into a single solid disc. She would walk past the pantry 3 times in the next 11 days without seeing the door that was set into its back wall flush with the paneling. She would walk past it 3 times before she finally saw it. But that was still ahead. She came out of the kitchen and stood in the back doorway looking at the yard between the house and the barn. The light had gone. The sun had dropped behind the ridge to the west, and the long fall of dusk had begun, the kind of West Texas dusk that lasted 40 minutes and was the most beautiful light Marin had ever seen, though she had only seen it a handful of times in her life. The windmill stood out against the eastern sky, slowly turning. The barn was 40 yards from the back porch. Beyond the barn, she could see the corner of the smokehouse. To the south, between the house and the creek, were the 3 cottonwoods. To the north, on the slight rise behind the barn, was a small wooden structure that she realized only after a moment was the outhouse, which had probably been the only sanitation Edith's mother had ever known. Marin stood in the doorway. She thought about going back to the car. She thought about driving back to Marathon and finding a motel. She did neither of those things. She walked through the kitchen to the front room and out the front door, and she went down the rise to the Civic, and she took out her overnight bag, and the sleeping bag, and the camp stove, and the tote of supplies, and she carried them back up to the house in 2 trips. She carried the lockbox last of all, in both hands like something she might drop. She closed the front door behind her. She lit a candle she had bought at the Walmart. She set it on the long pine table in the front room. She unrolled her sleeping bag onto the wedding ring quilt in front of the wood stove and laid her tote of supplies on a chair beside it. And she took a single match from the brass safe, and she struck it on the side of the stove, and she lit the fat wood splinters in the firebox. The stove caught on the first try. The chimney drew clean. Marin sat down on the floor in front of the open stove door and watched the flame catch the dry juniper, and the warmth came up at her with the smell of the wood, and her shoulders, which she had not realized she had been holding stiff for nearly a month, came down half an inch. She heated water on the camp stove because she did not yet trust the cook stove until she had checked the chimney by daylight. She made instant coffee. She ate a granola bar. She unrolled her sleeping bag, and she lay down on the floor of the front room of her grandmother's house, fully dressed, with her work boots set neatly beside her on the rug, and she watched the firelight move on the beadboard ceiling for a long time before she fell asleep. She did not dream. She woke at 5:45 in the morning to a kind of quiet she had not heard in 50 years, the deep, absolute quiet of a piece of land where no engine and no neighbor and no streetlight and no airplane and no television had reached. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. The candle on the pine table had guttered out. The clock on the south wall was still stopped at 4 minutes after 7. Marin sat up. She put on her boots. She walked outside. The light was just coming up behind the eastern ridge, a thin band of pale gold along the horizon under a sky that was still navy at the top and lavender along the edges. Frost lay on the bunchgrass. The windmill was turning slowly in a breeze she could not feel on her face. Somewhere out past the cottonwoods, a covey of quail called to each other in their small, ratcheting voices. Marin stood on the front porch in the cold, and she breathed in deeply, and she breathed out, and she watched her breath go white in the air in front of her, and she understood that whatever happened next, she was alive in a way she had not been alive for a very long time. She made coffee on the camp stove. She drank it on the porch. She made a list on the back of an envelope. Check the well. Check the cook stove chimney. Check the wood stove chimney from the roof when light is full. Check the cistern. Check the barn for hay, tools, condition of the structure. Check the cellar entrance for the lock. Find the cellar key on the ring. Walk the fence line if the boots hold up. Find the property line markers. Inventory the contents of the kitchen china cabinet against the list. Check the cedar chest in bedroom 1. She did not put the last item at the top. She did not put it at the bottom. She put it where it belonged, in the order she would actually do things, because Marin Whitlock had been a working woman for 31 years, and she knew that the things you wanted to do most were the things you did after the things that had to be done first. She started with the well. The well pump on the kitchen dry sink turned out to be a hand pump connected to a holding tank on the backside of the house, which was filled by the windmill on a calm day or by the manual operation of the pump on the well casing out by the barn on a still day. Marin walked out to the barn in the rising light, and she found the manual pump on the casing, and she primed it with the half-gallon of drinking water she had brought from Fort Stockton, and after 14 full strokes of the handle the well brought up its first water in 63 years. The water came up clear. Marin held a glass beneath the stream for a moment, looking at it. She did not drink it yet. She was not a fool. She would take a sample to the county extension agent in Alpine before she drank or cooked with any of it. But the water was clear, and it ran cold, and it had the faint, sharp mineral smell of a deep aquifer well, and Marin, who had grown up drinking water from a well very much like it, knew at the back of her throat that the water was probably good. She filled the holding tank halfway and pumped it dry to flush it. She filled it a second time and let it stand. She would check it again at noon. She walked into the barn. The barn was a board and batten structure perhaps 40 feet long, with a long axis running east-west, 2 big sliding doors at the south end, and a smaller side door on the north. Inside, the air smelled of dry hay and dust and old leather. A loft above ran the length of the building. There were 2 stalls on the east side and a tack room on the west. There were tools on pegs on the wall, a hand-cranked grindstone, a scythe, a draw knife, a bow saw, a long-handled hay fork, 2 buckets, a galvanized washtub, a pair of leatherwork gloves so old they had cracked, a coil of hemp rope that crumbled when Marin touched it, a wooden hay rake, a horse collar with the brass rosettes still bright, a set of trace chains, a hand-forged hoof pick. The tools were old. Many of them were no longer of use. But the barn itself was sound. The roof had held. The siding had been kept under coats of creosote that had blackened the wood and saved it. The loft beams were thick and square and showed no signs of failure. Whoever had built this barn had built it to last 150 years, and it had so far. Marin came back out of the barn and walked the perimeter of the house. She found the cellar entrance on the north side, a slanted double door of weathered oak set flush against the foundation, painted once a dark red that had weathered to the color of rust. A heavy iron hasp held the doors shut, locked with a padlock that looked nearly as old as the house. She tried 3 keys on the ring before she found the one that fit. She turned it. The padlock opened. Marin stood there for a long moment with the open lock in her hand. The cellar doors were heavy. The smell of cold earth came up at her from the crack between them. She did not open the doors. Not yet. Her grandmother's inventory had said, "Cellar, keep locked. Do not open without my present." E.M.H. Marin had thought it was a typo when she first read it. Now, standing in the morning light with the open padlock in her palm, she thought perhaps it had not been. She did not know yet what Edith had meant by her present, but she suspected that Edith, who had not been a woman who made spelling mistakes, had meant exactly what she had written. Whatever was down there, Marin would meet it the right way or she would not meet it at all. She closed the hasp. She put the padlock back through it and clicked it shut. She put the key on the ring in her cardigan pocket. She walked back around the house and was halfway up the porch steps when she heard the engine. It was a long way off, but it was the only engine within 5 miles, and on a still West Texas morning, a single old pickup truck on a caliche road carried a great distance. Marin straightened up. She turned. She watched the dust plume rise on the county road from the south, and a moment later the pickup itself came around the curve at the bottom of her rise, an old Ford, faded blue, with a single figure at the wheel. The truck stopped at the chain across her gate. The figure got out, slowly, and rehung the chain after he had driven through. He drove up the caliche track and parked the Ford at the bottom of her rise, beside her Civic. He killed the engine. He sat in the cab for a moment, looking up at her on the porch. Then he opened the door and got out, and Marin saw that he was an old man, 80 or close to it, lean and weathered, in a sheepskin coat and a sweat-stained cattleman's hat, and he was carrying a thermos in one hand and a small foil-wrapped bundle in the other. He walked up the rise slowly, in no hurry. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm with Tarrant. My place is east of yours about 1.5 miles over that ridge. I saw the dust on the road last evening and the lights up at the house last night, and I told my granddaughter I'd come over this morning and see who was here, because I knew the woman who used to own this place, and I know nobody has been up here in 60 years. Marin came down off the porch 1 step. She stopped on the 2nd step from the top. "I am Marin Whitlock," she said. "I'm Edith May Holcomb's granddaughter." The old man took his hat off entirely. "Well," he said, "I'll be." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitlock, my father knew your grandmother. He bought the place east of here from her uncle in 1938, and he and Edith ran cattle together for 30 years on a handshake without a fence between them. He died in 1981. I'm Whitman, his son. Folks call me Whit. I'm 82 years old, and I have lived on the other side of that ridge for every one of those 82 years except the 3 I spent in Korea, and I do not recall ever meeting a granddaughter of Edith Holcomb's, but I have wondered for a long time who would finally come." Marin came the rest of the way down the steps. She held out her hand. Whit Tarrant took it in his. His hand was the kind of hand a man develops over 60 years of fencing and roping and pulling calves in March mud, and Marin, who had thought she remembered what a working man's hand felt like, realized she had forgotten. He held it for a long moment before he let it go. "I brought coffee," he said, "and my granddaughter made biscuits this morning. I thought you might not have eaten." He raised the thermos. "I have not," Marin said. "Then sit down on those steps, Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "and let an old man tell you a few things about your grandmother that I expect you have a right to know. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." They sat on the front steps of the porch, and Whit Tarrant poured coffee from his thermos into 2 enamel cups he had brought from his truck, and he unwrapped the foil bundle on the step between them. The biscuits were still warm. They were the kind of biscuits Marin's mother used to make. Marin took one and ate it slowly, holding the coffee in her other hand, and she did not speak, because Whit Tarrant had not yet started speaking, and Marin had learned a long time ago that when an old man has something to tell you, you let him find his way to it. He found his way to it after the second biscuit. Edith Holcomb, he said, was the best woman I knew when I was a boy. My mother thought so too. She and your great-grandmother Maud were old friends, going back to before the First World War. Edith was Maud's only child. She inherited this place from her mother in '39, the year after my father bought ours. Marin nodded. She did not interrupt. She had been married, Whit said. The Holcomb she married. Hardin Holcomb. He was a Holcomb from Coleman County. He came down here to ranch in the late '20s, and he married Edith in '29, and they had your mother in '31, and he was a hard man, Mrs. Whitlock. I am sorry to tell you that, because you bear his name on your mother's side, and a man does not like to speak ill of another man whose blood runs in someone he is sitting next to. But Hardin Holcomb was a hard man. He drank. He laid hands on Edith more than once. My mother knew about it. My father knew about it. There was not very much anybody could do about it in '38 and '39 in Brewster County, Texas, except to be a good neighbor and to look the other way at the right moments. Marin set her coffee down on the porch step beside her. Her hand was very steady. Hardin died, Whit said, in '46. He drowned in Cottonwood Creek in a spring flood when your mother was 15 years old. Some folks said it was an accident. Some folks said Edith pushed him. Some folks said the creek did the work that needed doing and Edith stood on the bank and did not jump in after him, which by any reasonable accounting in this country would have been a poor decision in a flood anyway. I was 4 years old. I do not pretend to know what happened. What I know is that after Hardin was buried, Edith Holcomb stood up taller in her own kitchen, and she ran this place alone for the next 40 years, and she did not remarry, and she did not look back, and she taught your mother to read, and to ride, and to shoot. And she sent her to college in Lubbock when nobody on this side of the Pecos River sent a daughter to college if they could help it. Marin had stopped breathing. She made herself breathe. Whit was quiet for a moment. He looked off at the cottonwoods. Then he said, in 1962, Edith closed up this house, and she moved into a small place she rented in Marathon, and she lived there until she died in '86. She did not sell this ranch. She did not let it go to seed. She paid a man named Lloyd Massey out of Alpine to come out twice a year for 30 years to check on the house and the barn, and to grease the windmill bearings, and to repair anything that needed repairing, and Lloyd died in '94, and his son took over until his son died in 2008. And after that there was a fellow named Kevin Pradesh who came twice a year until 2 years ago, when I do not know what happened to the arrangement. But the dust started getting thicker on the porch, and the windmill started turning rougher, and I started wondering whether somebody was going to come. He looked at her. I have wondered for a long time who was going to come, Mrs. Whitlock, he said. I am very glad it was you. Marin sat on the steps, and she held her coffee, and she did not speak. After a while she said, why did she close the house in '62? Whit Tarrant turned his enamel cup in his hands. Your grandmother was 61 years old in '62, he said. Her right hip had begun to go on her, and she was finding it hard to keep the place up alone, and Marathon had a doctor, and she had a friend in Marathon who had a spare bedroom. She did not want to live with anyone in particular, but she wanted to be near the doctor. She moved into town. She closed the house. She told my mother once, around 65, that the house was meant for someone in the family, and she was saving it for the right person to come along, and she would know that person when the time came. My mother asked her if she meant her daughter, your mother. Edith said no. My mother asked her if she meant a granddaughter. Edith said maybe. And then Edith said, if it is a granddaughter, I expect she will be a woman who has had to learn the hard way that her own name belongs to her, and not to anybody else. I expect she will come when she is ready. Marin closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she said, I am 74 years old, Mr. Tarrant. I was married for 51 years to a man who took everything I had and gave it to a younger woman. I have $41,000 to my name and a Honda Civic and the clothes in that bag inside, and I did not know about this ranch until 2 days ago. Whit Tarrant nodded slowly. He did not look surprised. That sounds about right, he said. That sounds about exactly what Edith would have expected. He set his coffee cup down. He said, Mrs. Whitlock, I am going to do something I have not done in 20 years, which is to tell you what I think before you have asked me. You do not have to listen. But you have come a long way to a place you did not know existed, and I have spent a long time waiting for somebody to come, and I am 82 years old, and I do not have very many afternoons left to spend on indirectness. Marin nodded for him to go on. This is good land, he said. 211 acres is not a big ranch by Brewster County standards, but it has the water on it, and it has the grass for 40 head of mother cows if you wanted to lease it for grazing, and the house is solid, and the barn is solid, and the well is good. You will not get rich on this land. You can live on it. You can live well on it if you are careful, and if you are not too proud to ask for help, and you would not have come this far if you were the kind of woman who could not ask for help when she needed it. He paused. He said, I do not know what is in your cellar. Edith never spoke of it. My father never spoke of it. My mother said once that whatever Edith kept down there was Edith's business and not anybody else's. I would not go down there alone in the dark if I were you. I would go down there in the daytime, with somebody who could fetch help if you broke an ankle. I am offering my services to that end. My granddaughter would also volunteer. Her name is Sage. She is 31. She teaches 6th grade in Marathon. She has been waiting almost as long as I have for somebody to come up the road. Marin smiled. The first smile in 3 weeks. Mr. Tarrant, she said, I would be grateful for your help, and I would be grateful to meet your granddaughter. Whit, he said. Marin, she said. They shook hands a second time, sitting on the porch steps with the coffee cups between them. Then Whit Tarrant said, there is one more thing. He reached into the inside pocket of his sheepskin coat. He brought out a small folded square of paper. He held it for a moment before he handed it across. My mother gave this to my wife when I married her in '64. She told my wife to give it to me to keep, and she told me to keep it until somebody came to live at Holcomb Ridge, and then to give it to that person. My wife died 12 years ago. I have kept this in a drawer in my bureau for 43 years. I have not read it. I do not know what it says. It is not mine to read. He set the folded paper in Marin's open palm. I imagine your grandmother wrote it, he said. I imagine it is for you. Marin unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Edith's. The same sharp slanting blue ink as the inventory. 3 sentences. The cellar opens with the small brass key on the ring, not the iron one. The light switch is on the south wall to the left of the steps as you go down. Do not bring a man down with you on the first time. E.M.H. Marin read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her cardigan pocket with the keys. She did not tell Whit Tarrant what it said. She said only, thank you, Whit. You have done exactly what she wanted you to do. He stood up. He picked up the empty thermos and the foil from the biscuits. He put his hat back on. He said, Mrs. Whitlock, I am going to drive back to my place now, and I am going to telephone my granddaughter, and I am going to tell her that Edith Holcomb's granddaughter has come to Holcomb Ridge, and I expect she will be over here before supper time with food and bedding and probably a few other things you do not know you need yet. Please do not be too proud to accept it. Edith would not have been. He walked down the rise to his truck. He raised his hand without turning around. He drove down the Caliche track and through the gate and away east into the morning. Marin sat on the porch step for a long time after he was gone. Then she went into the house, and she set Edith's note on the pine table in the front room, and she sat down at the table with her hands folded on the wood, and she looked at the note, and she understood that her grandmother had known 43 years ago, perhaps longer, that there would come a day when a woman of her own blood would come to this porch alone and would need to be told several things in a specific order, and that her grandmother had arranged for those things to be told. The world hides things in plain sight, Edith had said in 1968 to a 13-year-old Marin at her own daughter's funeral. And you have got the kind of eyes that see them. Marin had spent 51 years learning not to see. It was time to remember how. She stood up. She went outside. She walked the perimeter of the house. She found that the backyard between the house and the barn had been kept down to grass once, and that the grass had gone wild and was now mixed with prickly pear and Indian blanket and a few volunteer mesquite seedlings she could pull out by the roots with her hands if she did it before they got any bigger. She walked the line of the creek. The water in Cottonwood Creek was thin and clear, running over a bed of round limestone cobbles, no deeper than her ankle in most places, though there was a long, quiet pool below the cottonwoods that was deep enough for a heron to fish in. She watched a heron stand in that pool for a long while. She walked the fence line on the east side as far as the section of barbed wire that marked the start of Whit Tarrant's place. The fence had been kept. The wires were tight. The cedar posts were still firm. Someone had been doing the work. She walked back to the house. She spent the rest of the morning checking the chimney on the cook stove from inside the firebox with her flashlight, and the chimney on the wood stove from the clean-out in the cellar wall, which she could reach without going down the cellar stairs. Both chimneys were clean. The mortar was sound. The flue dampers worked. Whoever Lloyd Massey and his son and Kevin Pradesh had been, they had earned their pay. At noon, she heated water in the kettle and made a real cup of coffee on the cook stove. The stove drew well. The kettle boiled in 9 minutes. Marin sat at the green pine table in the kitchen and drank the coffee and ate a piece of cheese she had bought in Fort Stockton, and she opened the cedar chest in the first bedroom. Inside were 6 quilts, each one folded in tissue paper, each one as good or better than the wedding ring on the chair in the front room. Inside the quilts were a christening gown in a linen drawstring bag, a small bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, a daguerreotype in a velvet case of a woman Marin did not know, who must have been Edith's mother Maud, holding a baby that must have been Edith herself in 1901, a small ivory pocket comb, a child's pair of leather shoes, a bound book of pressed wildflowers, each one labeled in a handwriting older even than Edith's. She did not read the letters yet. She put everything back. She closed the chest. She did not feel rushed. She did not feel alone. That afternoon, Whit Tarrant's granddaughter Sage arrived in a Subaru Forester full of supplies, and the dog arrived with her, lying in the back seat of the Subaru with his chin on his paws, watching Marin through the rear window as Sage opened the back hatch. Sage Tarrant was tall, dark-haired, sun-browned, wearing jeans and a denim shirt, and the same kind of work boots Marin had bought at the Walmart in Fort Stockton. She had her grandfather's eyes. She had a Pyrex casserole dish in her arms and a tote bag full of groceries hanging from her elbow. "Mrs. Whitlock," she said, smiling. "I am Sage. Grandpa called me at lunchtime. I brought you supper and a few other things. The dog is named Pritchard. He has been my grandpa's dog for 9 years, and he turned up at my front door this morning at 6 in the morning and refused to leave. And Grandpa told me on the phone an hour ago that Pritchard has apparently made an executive decision, and Grandpa would appreciate it if you would consider providing him with room and board until further notice." Marin looked at the dog in the back of the Subaru. The dog looked at Marin. He was a blue heeler, gray at the muzzle, 50 pounds of muscle and patience, with one ear that stood up and one that did not. He held Marin's eyes for a long moment without blinking. "His name is Pritchard," Marin said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," Sage said. "Like Owen Pritchard," Marin said. "The Welsh carpenter who built this house." Sage's eyebrows went up. "You know that name." "My mother left me a letter," Marin said. "It mentioned him." Sage smiled. She set the Pyrex on the porch step. "My grandfather named that dog after a stonecutter named Pritchard who worked in Marathon when my grandfather was a boy. He used to say the dog was as steady as a man named Pritchard, and that was a high compliment in his book. I did not know there had been a Pritchard up here, too." She opened the back door of the Subaru. Pritchard came down off the seat in one slow, careful motion. He walked across the gravel to Marin, and he sat down at her feet, and he looked up at her, and his stub of a tail, which Marin had not noticed was missing the end of it, moved once in a small, dignified wave. "Hello, Pritchard," Marin said. She crouched down. She put her hand on the top of his head. His fur was warm. His ear that stood up flicked once. He leaned, very slightly, against her knee. That was the afternoon Marin Whitlock acquired a dog. Sage had brought, by Marin's count, sufficient food for 8 days, a propane heater that ran off the same kind of cylinder Marin had bought at the Walmart, an extra sleeping bag, 2 pillows, a stack of clean towels, a battery-operated lantern, a roll of duct tape, a bottle of vinegar, a bottle of dish soap, a sack of cracked corn — Grandpa said you'd be wanting chickens — and a thermos of homemade beef stew, still warm, that Marin opened and ate at the green pine table in the kitchen while Sage sat across from her and asked careful, unobtrusive questions about how Marin had ended up there. Marin answered them honestly. She had learned a long time ago that some kinds of kindness deserve the truth in return. Sage stayed for 2 hours. She showed Marin how to bleed the air out of the propane heater. She helped Marin carry firewood from the barn to the wood box in the front room. She left her phone number and her grandfather's phone number written in pen on the back of a Marathon Country Store receipt and stuck it to the door of the refrigerator that was not on yet, with a magnet she had brought with her. "I will come back on Sunday," she said at the door. "I will bring my husband. He is a contractor. He can look at the wiring for you and tell you what you have got and what you do not. If you want it, he will not say a word otherwise." "I want it," Marin said. Sage smiled. She nodded. Then she got in the Subaru, and she drove down the caliche track and away. Pritchard the dog stayed. He sat in the doorway and watched Sage's taillights disappear. He looked back at Marin. He walked into the front room and lay down on the wedding ring quilt in front of the wood stove as if he had been doing it every night of his life, and he sighed once, deeply, and he closed his eyes. Marin stood in the doorway watching him. She did not know yet that on the 11th day, she would walk into the pantry to put a jar of preserves on the shelf, and she would lean against the back wall to reach the top shelf, and the wall would move, half an inch, with a small whisper of wood on wood that she would feel through her shoulder before she would hear it. She did not know yet that she would step back and look at the wall and run her hand along the seam between the paneling and the door frame and find the catch hidden behind a knot in the pine. She did not know yet that the panel would swing inward on hinges so well oiled they did not creak, even after 63 years, and reveal a narrow room behind the pantry no wider than her arms outstretched, a room she had not seen on any side of the house from any window or from outside, a room that had been built inside the structure of the house in a way only someone who knew exactly what they were doing could have built. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew, that afternoon, was that she had a dog now, and a coffee pot, and a stove that drew clean, and a windmill that turned, and a creek that ran in the spring, and a deed in her own name, and an old neighbor who had been waiting 43 years to deliver a note from her grandmother, and the small dry weight of a folded piece of paper in her cardigan pocket that told her the cellar opened with the small brass key, and that the switch was on the south wall, and that she was not to take a man with her the first time she went down. She closed the front door. She put 2 more pieces of juniper into the wood stove. She sat down on the floor beside Pritchard with her back against the quilt-covered chair, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she felt his warm, steady breathing under her palm, and she thought, very calmly, very clearly, that tomorrow morning she would go down into the cellar. Alone. She would meet whatever was waiting down there the way Edith had said to meet it. She would meet it on her own. Pritchard sighed again under her hand. The fire in the stove cracked once and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere off to the east, in the long, quiet country between Holcomb Ridge and the next ranch over, a single coyote called once into the falling dark, and another answered it from further away, and the night came down on the first day Marin Whitlock had ever spent on land that belonged to her. She did not yet know what was in the cellar. She did not yet know about the room behind the pantry, or the letters from Maud Holcomb to her own mother that began in 1898, or the strongbox under the floorboards in the second bedroom that held the deed to a quarter section of land north of the ranch that Edith had bought in 1957 with money Marin's mother had never been told about. She did not yet know about the small leather ledger in the bottom drawer of the dresser in the first bedroom that recorded 40 years of women's names and dates of arrival and departure and one-line notes in Edith's hand. She did not yet know about the small wooden box in the cellar that was 12 inches long and 7 inches wide and 4 inches deep and weighed almost 40 pounds and was, on the morning she would finally open it, the most beautifully made object she had ever held in her hands. She did not yet know any of it, but she knew the morning was coming, and the cellar key was in her pocket, and the dog was at her side, and her grandmother Edith May Holcomb, who had buried a hard man in Cottonwood Creek in 1946, and stood up taller in her own kitchen the next morning, had been waiting a long time for the right woman to walk down those stairs. Marin Whitlock was going to be that woman. The fire settled. Pritchard slept. She sat with her hand on him, and she watched the firelight on the beadboard ceiling. And at some point she did not notice. She fell asleep sitting up, leaning against the chair, the keys to her grandmother's cellar still warm in the pocket of her cardigan. The clock on the south wall, which had been stopped at 4 minutes after 7 for 63 years, stayed stopped. But the house, somewhere in its old bones, had begun to keep time again. Morning came up gray and slow. Marin woke at 5:30 with Pritchard's chin resting on her knee and the fire in the stove burned to a thin layer of red coals under white ash. The clock on the south wall was still stopped. The house was cold, but not bitter. She had slept on the floor in her clothes, and her shoulders ached in a familiar way, the way they had ached after long shifts at Midland Memorial, and she sat up slowly and let her hand rest on Pritchard's head and looked at the gray light coming through the east window for a long minute before she moved. She put coffee on the cook stove. She ate 2 of Sage's biscuits from the night before. She fed Pritchard a cup of dry food Sage had brought. and he ate it with the same patient deliberation he had eaten his supper, as if he understood that nothing in this new life of theirs was going to be rushed. She did not dress for the cellar in any special way. She put on her flannel shirt and her jeans and her work boots, and she clipped the battery lantern Sage had brought to her belt loop with a carabiner, and she put the small brass key from the ring into her right cardigan pocket and the folded note from Whit Tarrant's mother into her left. She drank the rest of her coffee, standing at the kitchen window, watching the windmill turn against the pale sky. Pritchard followed her out the back door. She walked around the north side of the house to the cellar entrance. The cellar doors were the way she had left them yesterday, the iron hasp closed but unlocked, the padlock hanging open through the staple. She bent and lifted the padlock free and set it on the limestone foundation beside the door. She put her hand on the wood. The door was heavy oak, weathered to a dark gray, and she could feel the dampness rising up through it from the earth below. She looked at Pritchard. "You stay up here," she said. He sat down on his haunches in the gravel and watched her. His ear that stood up flicked once. She pulled the cellar doors open. A flight of stone steps led down into dark, cool air. Marin clicked on the lantern and angled it down. She could see 7 steps, then a turn to the left at a small landing, then a wooden door at the bottom set into the foundation wall. The steps were limestone slabs, set into the earth on a base of crushed rock, the work of a man who knew exactly how to lay a stair that would not shift in 100 years. Owen Pritchard. She thought of the dog at the top of the steps, named for the carpenter who had built this house and the man who had laid this stair, and she felt the strange long thread of women remembering men, and men building for women, and women keeping the work safe until another woman came to find it. She went down. The air at the bottom of the stairs was the temperature of a deep cave, cool and dry, smelling of old stone and faintly of cedar. Edith had said the light switch was on the south wall to the left of the steps. Marin felt along the wall with her free hand. Her fingers found a small old-fashioned brass push-button switch set into a wooden plate. She pressed it. A single bulb in a wire cage came on above her head. The cellar opened in front of her. It was larger than she had expected. The room ran the full length of the house, perhaps 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, with a vaulted limestone ceiling that arched gently overhead and limestone walls that had been laid by hand without a single crooked seam. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. The air was cool and absolutely still. Along the east wall stood a long workbench of pine planks set on stone piers, its surface scarred by 60 years of use. Above the bench, hung on hand-forged iron pegs, were tools she did not recognize at first because she had not seen tools like them outside of museums. Small gouges, veiners, V-tools, a row of straight chisels in graduated sizes, a draw knife, a pair of dividers, a set of palm-carving knives in a wooden block, a small bench vise, a wooden mallet, a mortising chisel, a coping saw, a bow saw, a set of files, a leather strop, a small grinding wheel on a treadle base. Marin stood at the bottom of the steps with the lantern in her hand, and she looked at the tools, and she understood several things at once that she had never been told. Her great-grandmother Maud had been a carver. The realization came down on her with the steady, quiet weight of a thing recognized rather than discovered. Marin had pieces of Maud's work in her own life and had never known it. The walnut rocker upstairs in the second bedroom, with the curving back slats. The beadboard ceilings in the front room. The carved leaves on the back of the pew at the Methodist church in Lamesa where Marin had been baptized, which her mother had once said had been a gift from someone in the family. Maud Holcomb had carved them. Maud Holcomb had been an artist whose work no one in the family had spoken of, because in 1898 and 1908 and 1918 in Brewster County, Texas, women were not artists, they were ranch wives, and the work they did with their hands was either practical or it was nothing at all. Marin moved deeper into the cellar. Against the south wall stood a row of shelves with mason jars on them, the contents long since gone black with age. She walked past those without looking at them. Against the west wall, beside a small ventilation grate set into the limestone, sat the wooden box. It was on a low pedestal of cedar, raised perhaps 8 inches off the floor. It was the most beautifully made thing Marin had ever seen. The box was walnut, perhaps 14 inches long and 7 inches wide and 5 inches deep, with hand-cut dovetails so fine that the seams were nearly invisible, brass fittings darkened to the color of antique gold, and a hinged lid carved with a low relief of West Texas wildflowers, paintbrush and bluebonnet and gura and Mexican hat, each one rendered with such delicate detail that Marin could almost feel the petals. Across the front of the lid, in tiny incised letters, was carved a single line in script that was not quite English. Marin leaned closer to read it. Carried Bach, I firk Fwine Garrett. She did not know Welsh. But she did not need to know Welsh to understand the word carried, which she had heard once in her life from a Welsh nurse named Braun who had worked the cardiac floor with her in 1989. Carried meant beloved. Marin set the lantern down on the workbench. She crouched in front of the box. She lifted the lid. The inside of the box was lined with dark red silk, hand-stitched, with small pockets sewn into the lining to hold tools. Inside the pockets was a set of palm-carving knives, smaller than the ones hanging above the workbench. Each one fitted into its own pocket with a leather thumbstrap. Each handle hand-turned from a different wood, ebony and rosewood and lignum vitae, and olive, and one that Marin thought might have been African blackwood. 12 knives in all. They were Sheffield steel. The blades were dark with use, but not rusted. Whoever had used them had cleaned them and oiled them before they were put away the last time. Beneath the velvet tray that held the knives was a second compartment. Inside the second compartment was a small leather pouch. Marin lifted it out. It was heavier than she had expected. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. 7 silver dollars. Each one minted between 1881 and 1904. Each one wrapped in a small square of tissue paper. And beneath the silver dollars, folded small, a single sheet of cream-colored paper. Marin unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Maud's, very old now, the spidery handwriting of an elderly woman, dated September 1947. To my daughter Edith, and to whatever woman comes after her, these tools belong to my mother, who taught me, and to me, who never had time to teach you. The box was made for me by Owen Pritchard, who built this house with his own hands in 1898 and who loved me before I married your father. I did not marry Owen. I married a man my father chose. I do not regret your existence, Edith, but I regret the things I never asked for. The work I did with these tools was the only thing in my life that ever entirely belonged to me, and I hid it, and I am sorry that I hid it. The silver dollars are seed money. Use them or save them. Give the box to a woman in this family who needs to remember that she has hands. I love you. I have loved you all my life. Your mother, Maud Holcomb. Marin sat down on the cold cellar floor. She did not cry. She had not cried in a month. But she sat down on the cold floor of a cellar her great-grandmother had built, and she held the 7 silver dollars in one hand and the letter in the other, and she felt the long, quiet weight of 3 generations of women settling onto her shoulders, and she understood that the women in her line had been holding things for each other across nearly 100 years. Maud had hidden her tools because she had been told she should not have them. Edith had hidden the ranch because she had known Marin would need it. Wynne had paid the taxes for 43 years because she could not bring herself to tell Marin what Edith had wanted her to be told. And Marin had walked into a courthouse 3 days ago and signed her name to a piece of paper that ended 51 years of pretending she had a husband who loved her, and she had driven west, and she had come here, and the women who had loved her had been waiting. She put the silver dollars back in the pouch. She put the pouch back in the second compartment. She closed the lid. She did not yet move the box from where it sat. She stood up slowly and turned in a careful circle and looked at the rest of the cellar. There was more. Against the north wall, half hidden behind a hanging canvas tarp, was a metal strongbox the size of a small suitcase. Marin lifted the tarp aside. The strongbox was a Mosseler from the 1940s, gray-painted steel, with a small dial lock on the front and a hinged carrying handle on top. She tried the dial. It was locked. She would need to find the combination. It would be somewhere. Edith had not been a woman who hid keys without leaving instructions. Beside the strongbox, on a low shelf, sat a leather-bound ledger. Marin lifted it down. It was thick, perhaps 400 pages, and the leather was soft with age and use. The cover had no title. The first page, when she opened it, was dated May 11th, 1946. The handwriting was Edith's. Annabelle Krause, age 34, of Sanderson. 2 children, ages 6 and 4. Arrived May 11th, 1946. Bruises. Departed May 23rd, 1946 for Lordsburg, New Mexico, with $40 and a referral to my cousin Rose. Husband, Otis, does not know where she went. The second entry, dated August of the same year. Marie Kettering, age 22, of Marfa. No children. Arrived August 14, 1946. Departed September 1st, 1946 for Tucson with $30 and the address of the boarding house. Husband, Cleveland Kettering. Does not know. Marin turned the page. Lily Yancey, age 41. 2 children. Bruises and a broken wrist. Stayed 3 weeks. Sent to her sister in San Angelo. Hortense Mullinex, age 26. Pregnant. Stayed 6 weeks. Trained to Denver. Bess Cunningham, age 19. Stayed 2 months. Husband shot dead by her brother in November. She went home. Page after page of names. Page after page of dates and notes in Edith's careful blue ink. 40 years of women. 40 years of dates of arrival and dates of departure. Some of the entries were 1 line. Some of them were 6 or 7, with notes about money given, train tickets bought, letters carried, second husbands and safer towns. Marin read for a long time without moving. The last entry was dated June 1985, 11 months before Edith died. Constance Pugh, age 29, of Alpine. 1 child. Stayed 9 days. Sent to Albuquerque with $200. Husband, Avery Pugh. I am 84 years old and my hands are no longer strong enough for this work, and Constance is the last woman this house can shelter. May whoever finds this book do better than I did. May the door always stay open. Marin closed the ledger. She held it against her chest for a moment. Then she set it carefully on top of the wooden box. She picked up the lantern. She turned in a slow circle one more time, looking at everything. The workbench, the tools, the strongbox she could not yet open, the ledger that had recorded 40 years of women, and the wooden box Owen Pritchard had made for Maud in 1898. She turned out the light. She climbed the stone stairs. She came out into the gray morning air on the north side of the house. Pritchard stood up. He did not bark. He did not move toward her. He waited. Marin closed the cellar doors. She put the padlock back through the hasp. She turned and looked down at the dog. There were 47 names in that book, she said quietly. Pritchard tilted his head. There were 47 women, Marin said. She helped 47 women. Over 40 years. Out of 1 cellar. She crouched down. She put her hand on the dog's head. I'm going to keep that door open, she said. I'm going to figure out how. Pritchard leaned his shoulder against her knee. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. She found the room behind the pantry on the 11th day. It was a Thursday in late March. The dust on the road had settled. Whit Tarrant had come over twice more with biscuits and groceries. Sage had come back on Sunday with her husband Dax, who turned out to be a quiet, stocky, red-headed man of about 35 who had spent 4 hours inspecting the wiring and the foundation and the roof, and who had told Marin at the end of those 4 hours that the house was in better shape structurally than 90% of the new construction he saw in his line of work, and that with $11,000 he could rewire the entire house to current code and install a small solar array that would carry her loads through anything short of a week of cloudy weather, and that he would do the work himself on weekends if Marin was willing to pay him in cash and feed him lunch. Marin had written Dax a check that afternoon for the first half. Phil Markham had transferred funds into her new account that morning. The check had been the largest she had personally signed since 1991, when she had paid for her mother's first stroke rehabilitation out of her own pocket because her mother had been too proud to take Garrett's offer of help. The wiring work began the following Saturday. Marin had spent the 11 days between the cellar and the pantry doing the work of resettling a house. She had stripped the bedding off both beds in both bedrooms and laundered it at a coin laundry in Marathon, on a day when Sage drove her down. She had taken a sample of the well water to the county extension agent in Alpine, and the agent had told her the water was clean, and the only thing she might add over time was a small filter for sediment. She had bought a small generator and 10 gallons of gasoline. She had bought a small refrigerator from a man in Marathon who had been trying to sell it for 2 years. She had bought sheets and pillowcases and a new tea kettle and a cast-iron skillet and an enameled coffee pot. She had bought 2 chickens from a woman in Alpine, 2 laying hens of a brown breed Marin did not recognize, and had built a small coop for them out of cedar she pulled from the smokehouse, which Edith's inventory had said was empty and which Marin found when she finally went into it. was indeed empty but contained a stack of well-dried cedar boards that her grandmother had laid up there decades ago for a future use no one would ever know. The chickens were named Bertha and Pearl. They began laying within a week of being moved in. Marin ate the first egg standing at the kitchen window watching the sun come up over the eastern ridge, and she thought she had not eaten anything that fresh in 50 years. She had also, on the third day, called her cousin Ruth in Abilene. The call had been hard. Ruth had been Marin's closest cousin all her life. They had grown up together, summers in Lamesa, holidays at each other's houses. Ruth had married a CPA named Hollis and raised 3 children and worked as a hospital administrator for 30 years, and she had retired in 2019, and she had spent the last 3 weeks before Marin's call leaving messages on Marin's phone that Marin had not returned because she had not yet known what to say. When Marin finally called, sitting on the porch step at Holcomb Ridge with Pritchard's head on her boot, she told Ruth everything in a single long, unbroken sentence. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then Ruth said, "Marin Susanna Holcomb, you have a guest bedroom, do you not?" "I have too," Marin said. "I am driving down on Friday," Ruth said. "I am bringing my sewing machine. We are going to make curtains. Hollis is sending you a 100-pound roll of barbed wire for the south fence, because he says he will be damned if his wife's cousin is going to spend her widowhood with a sagging fence on her south boundary. Also, I am bringing a coffee maker because I am a woman of a certain age, and a percolator at 7 in the morning is too much for me." Marin had laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 3 months. Ruth came on Friday in a Buick Enclave loaded with curtains and bedding and a sewing machine and a coffee maker and a great deal of Hollis's bourbon and the 100-pound roll of barbed wire in the cargo area. She stayed 8 days. She and Marin made curtains for every window in the house, hung pictures Marin had brought in the tote from her mother's storage unit, scrubbed the kitchen, planted the small garden bed beside the back porch with onion sets Ruth had brought, and sat up 2 nights running until 11 at the kitchen table, drinking Hollis's bourbon and talking about things they had not been able to talk about in 50 years. The morning Marin found the door behind the pantry, Ruth had been gone for 3 days. The chickens were laying. The cook stove was lit. Pritchard was asleep in front of it. Marin was carrying a jar of preserves out to the pantry to put it on the second shelf from the top, and she leaned her shoulder against the back wall to steady herself as she reached up, and the wall moved. It moved half an inch, with a small whisper of wood on wood. She felt it through her shoulder before she heard it. She stepped back. She set the jar down on a lower shelf. She looked at the back wall of the pantry. It was pine paneling, 6-inch boards run vertically, painted a soft cream color, with a baseboard along the bottom and a small crown molding at the top, where the wall met the ceiling. To Marin's eye, fully accustomed now to the way Owen Pritchard built things, the wall looked like the rest of the house. But she had leaned against it, and it had moved. She ran her hand along the seam at the top, between the paneling and the crown molding. The seam was flush. She ran her hand along the seam at the bottom, between the paneling and the baseboard. The seam was flush. She ran her hand along the seam at the corner, where the back wall met the side wall. She found it. There was a knot in the pine, perfectly natural in appearance, about waist height, that was set just slightly proud of the surface of the board. Marin pressed it with her thumb. The knot moved. There was a small click somewhere behind the wall. A section of the paneling, almost 3 feet wide, swung inward on hinges that had been so perfectly oiled that they made no sound at all. Marin reached for the lantern she had left on the kitchen counter. She came back, lifted it, clicked it on. She stepped through. The room behind the pantry was small, perhaps 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep, with a ceiling that followed the slope of the roof on one side, and a small high window set into the gable wall that let a narrow band of late morning light fall across the floor. The window was on the east side of the house, in a place where, from outside, Marin would have sworn there was no window at all. She would later understand that Owen Pritchard had built the window into the gable end so that it sat directly behind the cedar slats of the original cistern downspout, and from any angle outside the house the window was invisible. The room was Maud Holcomb's studio. There was a workbench against the long wall. There was a stool. There was a wood rack on the side wall with raw blanks of walnut and cherry and pecan, each one labeled and dated by Maud's hand. There was a small wood stove in the corner, vented through what Marin would later realize was the backside of the kitchen chimney, a piece of work so cunning that the smoke from this stove and the smoke from the kitchen had risen as one column for 60 years without anyone in the world knowing there were two stoves. And on the walls, hung from simple wooden pegs, were Maud Holcomb's carvings. A bas-relief panel of West Texas wildflowers, perhaps 2 feet long and 18 inches high, every petal and leaf carved with a delicacy that took Marin's breath away. A small kneeling figure of a woman, perhaps 8 inches tall, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned slightly down, carved from a single piece of walnut. A bird, a thrush, life-sized, perched on a carved branch, the feathers detailed so finely Marin could see the down on the chest. A rectangular plaque carved with a Welsh inscription Marin could not read, set above the doorway like a household blessing. A pair of small figurines, an old woman and an old man, holding hands. A carved horse, 16 inches at the shoulder, the muscle and bone of the animal so true that Marin could feel the work in the carver's wrist as she looked at it. There were perhaps 15 pieces in the room. Each one was a museum piece. Each one had been hidden behind a panel in a pantry for more than 100 years. Marin stood in the doorway with the lantern in her hand, and she did not move. After a long while, she went back out through the panel. She walked through the kitchen and the hallway and the front room, and she opened the front door, and she sat down on the top step of the porch, and she put her face in her hands, and Pritchard came and sat down beside her, and she did not weep, but she sat there with her face in her hands for a long time, and Pritchard waited. When she finally lifted her head, she said to him, quietly, "We are going to need help." Pritchard wagged his stump of a tail once. The next phone call she made was to a woman she had not seen in 31 years, a former colleague from the cardiac unit at Midland Memorial, whose sister-in-law happened to be the director of the Bullock, Texas State History Museum in Austin. The call took 45 minutes. The woman at the other end laughed once and said, "Marin, I am driving down on Sunday, and I am bringing my sister-in-law with me. And if what you are describing is half of what you think it is, you are going to want a lawyer before you let anyone else through that door." Marin called Phil Markham that afternoon. She told him what she had found. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Marin, I am sending you to a woman named Imogene Burrell in Austin. She handled the Newcomb pottery dispute in 2017. She specializes in estates with significant decorative arts components. I am going to call her this afternoon, and I am going to tell her you are coming. You will need a place to stay in Austin for at least 2 days next week. I can stay with Sage's husband's parents in San Antonio," Marin said. "Sage already offered. Take them up on it," Phil said. "And Marin, listen to me." "Yes, Phil." "Marin, you understand what I am about to say?" "Yes, Phil, I do." "You do not tell Garrett. You do not tell anyone in his orbit. The carvings stay in the house until Imogene tells you otherwise. You do not let a stranger walk through that pantry. You do not put a single picture of any of those pieces on the internet. Whatever your grandmother and your great-grandmother were protecting, you protect it now, in the same way they did, until we have a plan." "I know, Phil," Marin said. "I know." Imogene Burrell came down the following week with Dr. Mabel Crane of the Bullock Museum and a curator from the Smithsonian Institution Folk and Self-Taught Art Collection, and a woman from the Texas Folklife Foundation, whose grandmother had been one of the women in Edith's ledger. They were in the house for 9 hours. They photographed everything. They drank coffee at Marin's green pine table. They spoke to Marin about something called a stewardship agreement, which Marin already knew the shape of because Phil Markham had explained it to her on the phone the night before. 8 months later, the Bullock, Texas State History Museum and the Smithsonian Folk Art Collection jointly placed Maud Holcomb's body of work, including the wooden toolbox made by Owen Pritchard in 1898, into a co-stewardship arrangement valued, after expert appraisal, at $1,900,000. The carvings would travel in rotating exhibitions for 30 years before returning to a permanent home Marin had chosen, which was a small museum in Alpine, Texas, 50 miles west of Holcomb Ridge, that had agreed to build a dedicated gallery for the work and to name it the Maud Holcomb Room. Edith's ledger went separately, with Marin's careful consent, to the Texas Folklife Foundation, which had begun by then a project of tracing 47 women and what had happened to them. By the time the project was 3 years old, they had found descendants of 41 of them. 6 of those descendants would come to Holcomb Ridge in the years that followed and stand on the porch and weep, and Marin would meet each one of them and pour them a cup of coffee and let them tell her, in their own words, the story of what their grandmothers or great-grandmothers had said about the Holcomb place when they had finally been old enough to speak of it. The strongbox in the cellar yielded its combination 3 weeks after Marin found it, when Sage's husband Dax was rewiring the kitchen and accidentally pried up a floorboard near the cook stove and found, taped to the underside, an index card in Edith's hand with the words Mosseler July 14th, 22. The strongbox contained the deed to 160 acres of land Edith had purchased in 1957 from a neighbor named Vance, adjacent to the north boundary of Holcomb Ridge. It contained correspondence from a Houston law firm dated 1985 regarding an escrow account in Marin's grandmother's name that held royalty payments from a producing oil and gas lease on the Vance property, which had been operating quietly since 1979 and which, because Edith had never communicated a current address to the law firm after she moved into Marathon in 1962, had been accumulating undeposited payments for 40 years. The total in escrow, when the law firm finally responded to Marin's letter through Imogene Burrell, was $416,000. It was enough. It was enough that Marin paid Dax in full for the wiring and the solar array. It was enough that she paid off the small balance Phil Markham had advanced her for Imogene's retainer. It was enough that she put $200,000 into an annuity Phil designed for her that would pay her $3,000 a month for the rest of her life. It was enough that she gave Ruth's husband Hollis a check for the value of the 100-pound roll of barbed wire, which Hollis refused to cash and instead put behind glass in his office in Abilene, where it stayed for the rest of his life. It was enough, finally, that she put $100,000 into a separate trust, named the Holcomb Ridge Trust, structured to do one specific thing: to keep the door open. The reckoning came in late October. It had been 6.5 months since Marin had stood in the kitchen on Albemarle Drive with her certified envelope on the counter. The cottonwoods at Holcomb Ridge had gone yellow. The chickens were down to 1 egg every other day. Marin had bought 3 more hens. She had put up a proper coop. She had built, with Dax's help on weekends, a small one-room cottage on the north side of the property, 100 yards from the main house, with its own stove and its own bed and its own door, intended as a place where a woman or a family who needed a quiet week could stay without imposing on anybody. She had spent most of one afternoon a week for 2 months sitting at the green pine table writing thank you notes to the women who had helped her, by hand, in ink, on the heavy cream-colored stationery Ruth had brought down on her second visit. She had written to Whit Tarrant. She had written to Sage and Dax. She had written to Imogene Burrell. She had written to Phil Markham. She had written to the woman in Alpine who had sold her the chickens. She had written to Eldred at SecureStay Storage on Big Spring Street and enclosed a check for the storage fees of the next 12 months on a unit she would no longer need, with a note asking him to use it however he liked. She had written, finally, on the last day of the second month, to Garrett. The letter to Garrett had been 1 paragraph long. Garrett, it had said, I am writing because I do not want you to hear it from someone else. I have inherited a small ranch in Brewster County that my grandmother left me in 1973. The ranch is mine and was never marital property. I am living there now. I am well. I do not require anything from you, nor do I owe you anything. I would prefer that you not contact me, but I am aware that you may at some point feel the need to. If you do, please do so by letter, not by telephone and not in person. The address is on the envelope. I am not interested in seeing you. I wish you no harm. Marin. She had sealed the envelope. She had taken it down to the post office in Marathon. She had not heard back. She had not expected to hear back. Garrett had not been a man who handled news that did not flatter him. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, almost 10 weeks after she had mailed the letter, that the gray Cadillac came up the road. Marin was in the chicken coop when she heard the engine. The chickens were not yet used to a gasoline engine on the property, and they ducked low under the roost and held still, the way wild birds did. Pritchard came around the corner of the house with his ears up. Marin stepped out of the coop and wiped her hands on her apron. The Cadillac was Garrett's. She had ridden in it for 4 years. It was a 2022 Escalade in pearl gray with the chrome wool package he had insisted on. It stopped at the chain across her gate. Garrett got out. She watched him from up at the chicken coop for a long moment. He was thinner than the last time she had seen him. He had not shaved in 2 or 3 days. He was wearing a navy blazer and gray slacks and a pair of expensive loafers that were entirely wrong for Kalichi. He unhooked the chain. He drove through. He rehooked it. He drove up to the bottom of the rise and parked the Cadillac beside her Civic, and he got out. and he walked up the rise toward her. Marin did not move to meet him. Pritchard sat down beside her. Garrett stopped 20 feet from her. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked at the house and the windmill and the cottonwoods and the small cottage on the north side, which was nearly finished now, and then he looked at her. "Marin," he said. "Garrett," she said. He took his hands out of his pockets. He held them up, palms out. In the gesture she had seen him use 1,000 times when he wanted to indicate that what he was about to say was not for argument. "Marin," he said, "I am here to talk." "I am not," Marin said quietly. He swallowed. He said, "Marin, I have made some mistakes. I am here to acknowledge them. I would like a chance to discuss whether there is a way for us to." "There is not," Marin said. He stopped. He had not expected to be stopped that quickly. He said, "Marin, please. I have driven 7 hours. I am not asking for anything. I am asking for a conversation. I have been thinking. I have been doing some work on myself. Tessa and I are not." "Garrett," Marin said, "I am not interested. I do not want to hear about Tessa. I do not want to hear what you have been thinking. I do not require an apology, and I do not require an explanation. There is nothing you can say to me that would change the shape of this afternoon. I would like you to get back in your car and drive away." He stared at her. He said, "Marin, this is not like you." She almost laughed. She did not laugh. She said, "Garrett, this is exactly like me. You did not know it was me, because for 51 years I did not know it was me either. But this is who I am. This is who I was at 22, before I married you. And this is who I would have been if I had not." He took a step toward her. Pritchard stood up. Garrett stopped. He looked at the dog. He looked at Marin. He looked at the house. He said, finally, "Marin, I have lost everything. The business is in trouble. Tessa left in August." I am sorry to hear that," Marin said. "I mean that. I do not wish you ill. But you do not get to lose everything and then drive 7 hours into my driveway and ask me to give it back to you. That is not how this works. That has never been how this works. That was the math you were doing for 51 years, and I was the one paying." She paused. She said, "Garrett, I am going to ask you one time to please get back in your car. After that I am going to call Mr. Tarrant from over the ridge, and he is going to call the sheriff, and the sheriff is going to come down here from Alpine, and none of that needs to happen. So please go." He stood there for a moment longer. He said, in a voice that was smaller than she had ever heard from him, "May I please use the bathroom before I leave?" "There is one in Marathon," Marin said. 41 miles. You can make it." He looked at her. She looked back. He turned, finally, and he walked down the rise to the Cadillac. He got in. He started the engine. He sat there for a long minute with the engine running. Then he put the car in reverse, and he backed it carefully down the caliche track to the gate, and he got out, and he unhooked the chain, and he drove through, and he rehooked it behind him. He did not wave. He did not look up at her. He drove away east toward the highway, and the dust rose up behind him in a thin plume on the still afternoon air, and Marin stood in front of the chicken coop with her hand on Pritchard's head, and she watched the plume of dust get smaller and smaller until it was gone. Then she went back to her chickens. That night she lit a fire in the wood stove, and she sat at the green pine table in the kitchen, and she ate a bowl of stew Ruth had made for her 2 days ago and frozen in a mason jar. She drank a glass of Hollis's bourbon. She wrote a letter to Imogene Burrell letting her know that Garrett had come and gone, and that she expected nothing further, but that she wanted it documented. She put the letter in an envelope and addressed it. She would mail it on Friday. Then she went to bed in the first bedroom, in the curly maple bedstead, on sheets Ruth had hemmed for her in May, with Pritchard on the rug beside the bed. She slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman who has finished a piece of work. Spring came back around to Holcomb Ridge. The cottonwoods leafed out. The creek ran clear. Bertha and Pearl and the 3 new hens were all laying. Sage was pregnant with her first child. Whit Tarrant had been over twice a week through the winter, and Marin had been over to his place once a week. And on Sunday afternoons, Whit and Marin and Sage and Dax often ate supper together at one or the other of the kitchens, and the conversations had begun to feel like the conversations of people who had been a family for longer than they had. Ruth came down in March for 2 weeks. Hollis came with her. He spent 3 days walking the fence line with Marin and a roll of new barbed wire and a post driver. And at the end of the 3rd day, he told her the south boundary was now the tightest fence in Brewster County, and Marin made him a pecan pie and a pot of coffee, and they sat on the front porch and watched the sun go down. The first woman who came to stay in the small cottage on the north side arrived in May. Her name was Tabitha. She was 34 years old. She had been referred by a women's shelter in Odessa. She stayed for 2 weeks. She slept 11 hours a night for the first 6 nights. She helped Marin in the garden in the mornings. She did not talk for the first 3 days. And then on the 4th day, she sat down at the green pine table in the kitchen, and she told Marin a story Marin did not write down, because Edith's ledger had taught her that some stories were the woman's to tell or not tell, and the only thing the house was required to do was hold them. Tabitha left on a Saturday morning. She carried a small canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes Marin had bought her at the Walmart in Fort Stockton, $150 in cash from the Holcomb Ridge Trust, the name and phone number of a woman in Albuquerque who would meet her at the bus station, and a small wooden bird that Marin had carved using a single straight chisel from Maud's box, which Marin had taught herself over the winter to handle, badly, slowly, with the patience of a beginner. The bird was not good carving. It was a clumsy beginner's bird, but Tabitha put it in her pocket as if it were the only thing in the world she owned. "You go on now, Tabitha," Marin said at the gate. "I will," Tabitha said. "You write me when you get there." "I will. You come back if you need to." "I might," Tabitha said. "I might just." She turned. She walked down the Caliche track to the road, where the Marathon Sheriff's deputy, who had been part of getting her out, was waiting in her cruiser to drive Tabitha to the bus station in Alpine. She got in. The cruiser drove away. The dust rose. The dust settled. Marin stood at the gate for a long moment. Then she walked back up the Caliche track to the house. Pritchard came out to meet her on the porch. She sat down on the top step. She put her hand on his head. She looked out over the long, west-leaning land of her grandmother's ranch, with the windmill turning in the spring breeze, and the cottonwoods green again, and the small cottage standing empty and ready, and she thought of all the women in her line who had held things across long silences. And she thought of the woman she had been at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in March at a counter on Albemarle Drive, with a certified envelope on the granite. And she thought of the woman she was. Now, 2 of those women were the same woman. She had not understood that for a long time. She understood it now. Inside the house, on the south wall of the front room, the grandfather clock was running again. Dax had wound it on a Sunday in June. The pendulum swung gently behind its glass door. The hands moved. The clock kept time the way the women in her line had kept time, slowly, deliberately, in their own rhythm, without anyone's permission, on land that belonged to them and to the daughters who would come after. Marin sat on the porch step in the spring light. Pritchard rested his chin on her knee. The windmill turned. The cottonwoods stirred. And somewhere on the long dirt road between Marathon and Holcomb Ridge, the dust of a single approaching car rose into the late afternoon sun, and Marin Whitlock, who was no longer Marin Whitlock and not yet quite Marin Holcomb again, but who was every day a little more the woman her grandmother had been waiting for, lifted her hand to her brow against the light, and she watched, and she waited, and she was home. The clock kept time. The door stayed open. The car was a maroon Toyota Highlander with Arizona plates. Marin watched it come up the Caliche track from the gate, slowly, the way a driver who is not used to dirt roads drives them, and she stayed where she was on the porch step until it stopped at the bottom of the rise, and the engine cut, and the 2 women inside opened their doors. Imogene Burrell got out of the driver's side. Marin had not expected her. Imogene had called from Austin the morning before to say she was coming up, but she had said she would bring someone with her, and she had not said who, and Marin had assumed a curator from one of the museums or perhaps a research assistant. The woman who got out of the passenger side was not a curator. She was about Marin's age, perhaps a year or 2 younger, with white hair cut short and a navy linen blazer that did not belong on a ranch road in May, and a face Marin did not recognize, and yet found herself looking at for a long second longer than she meant to, because something in the way the woman held herself was familiar in a way Marin could not place. The woman lifted her hand to her brow against the sun. She looked up at the porch. Imogene closed her car door and started up the rise. Marin stood up. "Marin," Imogene called. "I am sorry to drop in like this. May we have a few minutes of your time?" "Of course," Marin said. She watched the other woman come up the rise behind Imogene, slowly, in low-heeled shoes that were not made for Caliche. The woman was looking at the house, at the windmill, at the cottonwoods, at the small cottage on the north side, at the line of the creek. She was looking the way Marin had looked 14 months ago, when she had walked up this rise for the first time. When they reached the porch, Imogene stopped at the bottom step. "Marin," she said, "this is Mrs. Florence Kettering. She drove up to Austin yesterday from Tucson to see me. She has been looking for her grandmother for 41 years. Florence Kettering held out her hand. Marin took it. "Mrs. Whitlock," Florence said, "I am sorry to come without warning. I did not know quite how to telephone. I was afraid you would tell me not to come, and I have spent so much of my life thinking about this place that I needed to see it before I was too old to make the drive." Marin held her hand a moment longer than she needed to. The woman's hand was thin and dry and steady. She let it go. "Please," Marin said, "come inside. I have coffee on the stove." Pritchard had come around the corner of the house when the engine had stopped. He sat at the bottom of the porch steps now and watched the two visitors, the way he watched everyone these days, with the slow, careful patience of a dog who had appointed himself a position. Florence Kettering glanced down at him. She held out the back of her hand. Pritchard sniffed it once and lay down across the doorway of the porch. "He approves," Marin said. "Then I am glad of it," Florence said. The three women went inside. Marin had laid in a kitchen for guests over the last several months. The green pine table was set with a small jar of bluebonnets cousin Ruth had cut from the road's shoulder the weekend before. A loaf of bread from the bakery in Marathon sat under a linen cloth on the sideboard. The coffee on the cookstove had been on for an hour. Marin took down 3 of Maud's china cups from the built-in cabinet and set them on the table. Florence sat down at the far end of the bench. She did not take off her blazer. She sat with her hands folded on the wood in front of her, and she looked at the room slowly, in the careful way of a person who had imagined a place for a very long time and was now comparing the place to the imagining. "You were here," Marin said quietly. "I am sorry," Florence said. "My grandmother." Marin nodded toward the calendar still on the wall beside the cookstove, frozen at June 1962. "You were sitting where she would have sat. The bench is original." Florence put her hand on the wood. She left it there for a long moment. "I do not know if I have the right to be here," Florence said. "I want you to know that. I drove up because Imogene wrote me a letter in March, and I have carried the letter in my purse for 2 months trying to decide whether to come, and yesterday morning I got into the car in Tucson because I knew that if I did not come now I would not come." "You have the right to be here," Marin said. "Your grandmother was here. That makes this your place too." She poured the coffee. Imogene took her cup with both hands. Florence took hers without looking up. The steam rose between them in the cool kitchen. "Tell me about her," Marin said. "I do not know anything about your grandmother that is not in the ledger. I would like to know what you know." Florence drew a long, slow breath. "Her name was Marie," she said. "Marie Esther Kettering. She was 22 years old in 1946. She lived in Marfa. She was married to a man named Cleveland Kettering, who worked at the lumber yard. I never knew him. He was already dead by the time my mother was old enough to remember anything. Killed in a car accident on the highway between Marfa and Alpine in 1953, drunk at 3 in the morning, and good riddance is what my mother used to say when she felt like saying anything about it, which was almost never." She paused. "My grandmother left Marfa on the 1st of September in 1946, Florence said. She arrived in Tucson 8 days later by way of 3 trains and a bus. She had $30 and the address of a boarding house and the name of a woman named Inez who would meet her. She told the woman in the boarding house her last name was Esther, which was her own middle name, and she lived as Marie Esther for 3 years until Cleveland died, and she felt safe enough to use Kettering again." Marin listened. "She married a man named Frank Calderon in Tucson in 1948, Florence said. She had 3 children. My mother was the middle one. Marie taught 3rd grade at a school in South Tucson for 27 years, and she died of a stroke in February 1989, 6 months after she retired, and she never in her life spoke a single word to any of her children or grandchildren about Marfa, or about Cleveland, or about how she came to Tucson, or about any of it." Florence stopped. She looked up at Marin. "We did not know any of it," she said. "We knew she had been married before. We knew the man had died. We did not know she had ever been to Marfa. We did not know there had been violence. We did not know she had been 22 and alone with $30 on a train through New Mexico. We did not know about Edith Holcomb. We did not know any of it until your lawyer wrote her letter." She put her cup down. "Mrs. Whitlock," she said, "may I see the entry?" Marin had thought she would ask. She had made a copy of the ledger page that morning, before Imogene's call, in case it was something like this. She kept the original in the cellar, in the strongbox. but she had made a clean photocopy and laid it inside a sheet of stiff cardstock in the drawer of the sideboard, the way Edith would have done. She brought it out now. She set it on the table between them. Florence Kettering looked down at her grandmother's name written in the careful blue ink of a woman she had never met. Marie Kettering, age 22, of Marfa. No children. Arrived August 14, 1946. Departed September 1, 1946 for Tucson with $30 and the address of the boarding house. Husband, Cleveland Kettering. Does not know. Florence put one finger on the page. She traced the words slowly. She did not weep. Her face was steady. But Marin saw the small movement at the corner of her mouth that meant a woman in her 70s was holding herself together by long and stubborn practice, and Marin did not look away, because looking away from a woman holding herself together was a small kind of cruelty Marin had decided she was finished with. Imogene, very gently, picked up her own coffee and turned toward the window to give them the room. After a long while, Florence said, "She was here for 18 days. Yes, Marin said. What did she do here? I do not know exactly, Marin said. The ledger does not say. But I have come to believe, from reading all of it, that the women slept and they ate and they were quiet and they were not afraid. And after a while they began to think about where they would go next, and Edith helped them think about it. And when they were ready, Edith put them on a train." Florence nodded. "She slept here," Florence said. "She ate at this table." She did. The two women sat in the kitchen with the photocopy on the wood between them. After a long while, Florence said, "May I see the rest of the house?" Marin stood. She led Florence Kettering, who was the granddaughter of the second woman in Edith May Holcomb's ledger, through the front room with its long pine table and its wood stove and its running clock, and down the narrow hallway to the first bedroom, where the wedding ring quilt was now folded on the foot of the curly maple bedstead, and to the second bedroom with the rocking chair, and back to the kitchen with the green pine table where they had sat. Marin did not take Florence into the pantry or down to the cellar. Some rooms in this house were not for visitors, even visitors who had a kind of claim on the place. Florence did not ask. They stood for a moment at the back door looking out at the small cottage on the north side. "What is that?" Florence asked. "A cottage," Marin said. "For anyone who needs a quiet week." Florence looked at her. "Anyone," she said. "Anyone," Marin said. Florence Kettering closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she said, very softly, "My grandmother kept a small wooden bird on the windowsill of her kitchen in Tucson for 40 years. She told me once when I was 8 years old that a Welsh woman in Texas had carved it for her. She did. Not say where in Texas. I have wondered my whole life whether the woman was real." Marin felt the breath go out of her. She did not speak. Florence said, "I brought it with me. It is in the car. I thought you might know whether it belonged here." Marin nodded slowly. She did not trust her voice yet. She walked Florence down to the maroon Highlander. Florence opened the passenger door and took out, from a soft cloth bag on the seat, a small carved bird. A thrush, 5 inches long, pale walnut, darkened with age and the oil of 40 years of being handled. The feathers on the chest detailed so finely Marin could see the down on them. She held it in her palm. It was Maud's work. She had seen the larger thrush in the hidden room behind the pantry 16 times now. She had stood in front of it on 6 separate visits trying to understand what it was about Maud Holcomb's birds that made them feel like living animals that had only stopped for a moment. The small bird in Marin's hand had been carved by the same person, perhaps as a study for the larger piece, perhaps as a separate thing. "This is hers," Marin said. "Maud Holcomb. My great-grandmother. She was a carver. We have her work now. Some of it is going to a museum in Alpine next year." Florence Kettering put her hand to her mouth. "She gave it to your grandmother," Marin said. "To Marie. As a parting gift, I imagine, when Marie got on the train. She would have meant for Marie to keep it." Florence stood there in the sun with her hand over her mouth and the small wooden bird between them in Marin's palm. "She gave it to my grandmother," Florence said. "Yes. And my grandmother kept it on her windowsill for 40 years. "Yes. And my mother kept it after she died, and I kept it after my mother died. And I have wondered." "Yes." Florence took the bird back from Marin's palm. She held it against her chest with both hands. She said, "I am going to leave it with you." Marin shook her head. "No," she said. "It is yours. It was Marie's. It is yours now." Florence shook her head back. "It belongs here," Florence said. "It belonged here a long time ago. She kept it for 40 years because it was the only thing she had from the 18 days that saved her life, and I have kept it for 36 because she could not tell me what it meant. You have given it back its meaning, Mrs. Whitlock. It belongs in this house. Please. Marin looked at the bird in Florence's hands. She looked at Florence's face. She thought of Edith standing on this porch in 1946, putting a small carved bird into the pocket of a 22-year-old woman who was about to get on a train to Tucson. She thought of Maud carving it in the studio behind the pantry, decades before, not yet knowing whose pocket it would travel in. She thought, finally, of what Edith had written at the end of the ledger. May the door always stay open. She took the bird back from Florence Kettering's hands. I will put it on the windowsill in the front room, Marin said, where the light is good, and when you come back, it will be there. When I come back, Florence said. Yes, Marin said. Come back, Florence. Come back next May. Bring your daughter. Bring your granddaughter if you have one. The cottage is here. The door is open. Florence Kettering wept then, but only briefly, and only a little, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist the way her grandmother had probably wiped her eyes 78 years before, and she nodded once and turned and walked back up the rise toward the house, and Marin and Imogene Burrell followed her in silence. They sat on the porch in the late afternoon. They drank a second cup of coffee. They did not say very much. Pritchard lay across Marin's boots. The windmill turned. Somewhere down by the creek, a mockingbird worked through 3 different songs in a row. At 5:15, Florence Kettering stood up. I have a long drive back to Tucson, she said. I would like to be over the New Mexico line before dark. Marin walked her down to the Highlander. Imogene was driving Florence as far as a hotel in Van Horn that night, then back to her own car in Austin in the morning. They stood at the bottom of the rise for a moment in the slanted yellow light. Florence reached into the pocket of her blazer. She took out a small folded photograph. This is my grandmother, she said. The only picture we have of her young. She was 20 in this. It is 2 years before she came here. I made a copy for you. Marin took the photograph. A young woman in a print dress on a porch somewhere in Marfa. Dark hair. Steady eyes. A face that did not yet know what was coming, but a face that had perhaps already begun to suspect. Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Thank you, Florence. I will put her in the ledger box. I will keep her safe. Florence got in the car. Imogene got in. The engine started. The Highlander turned in a slow, careful circle on the caliche and started back down the track toward the gate. Marin watched it go. She watched it stop at the gate. She watched Imogene get out and unhook the chain and drive through and rehook it the way Whit Tarrant had taught everyone who came to the ranch to do. And she watched the dust rise gently behind the car as it picked up speed on the county road. And she watched until the dust had drifted into nothing on the still May air. Then she walked back up the rise to the house. She stood in the front room with the small carved thrush in her palm. The light was coming in low through the west window. She walked over to the south windowsill, where the light would be steady for the longest in the morning, and she set the bird down on the painted wood. Pritchard sat at her feet. She put her hand on his head. The grandfather clock against the south wall, which had been stopped at 4 minutes after 7 for 63 years and had been running for 10 months now, ticked once and ticked again and went on ticking, and the small wooden bird that Marie Esther Kettering had carried in her pocket onto a train in September of 1946 sat in the late spring light of the room, where it had been carved 110 years before, and Marin Whitlock, who had finally let go of the name Whitlock in her own heart, even though she had not yet bothered to change it on any piece of paper that mattered, stood at her own kitchen window and watched the windmill turn over her own land, and she understood, with the kind of slow, steady clarity that came only to women who had waited a very long time to understand anything, that she was not the end of the story. She was the keeper of it for now. There would be other women. There would be other granddaughters in other rental cars on other afternoons. There would be other small carved birds returned to other windowsills. The door would stay open the way Edith had asked it to stay open, and Marin would be the one who kept it, until someone after her took the keys from the pine table in the front room and kept it instead. The bird on the windowsill was very small. It caught the light. Outside, the cottonwoods stirred. The windmill turned. The land held what it had always held. And the house, which had been waiting for a long time to be a house again, was at last exactly what it had always been meant to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.